All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Friday webinar. My name is Michael Lee, and I am CEO of Reconciled, and I have Ian Bouchett here with me, Director of Revenue Operations with Reconciled. And we have a wonderful presentation today that we're going to be doing about pricing and how you can leverage pricing to impact your business, especially during this time, during the season that we're in. If you have any questions throughout this time, please make sure to write those in the Q&A box, and we will take questions at the end. The presentation should be about 30 minutes or so, maybe a little less, and then we'll take questions at the end and leave plenty of time for that. So please definitely write your questions in the Q&A. Ian will be leading most of this presentation because this is an area of expertise for him, but I will also be providing information as well related to pricing and how it impacts both our business Reconciled as well as our customers and the advice we give them around pricing. So with that said, why don't we get started with some just quick introductions. Ian, why don't you move to the next slide? This is the agenda here. Yep. And so, yeah, I'm CEO of Reconcile. I started the business about 4.5 years ago, and I've had the fortune of working with some of the best people in the online accounting industry and a great team. I'm also a serial entrepreneur and have launched some other businesses as well, primarily one called Sizable, and that is a financial reporting application. And so, with that said, we'll have Ian here presenting here to present on this presentation. Ian is our Director of Revenue Operations, and Ian started working with us a few years ago and took over sales from me. And so I'll let Ian introduce himself, and he'll run right into the presentation.
Awesome, guys. So yeah, so again, just to reiterate, thanks for joining. My background is in entrepreneurship and customer acquisition, as some of you guys, folks that have joined, might know. So I'm really passionate about the sales process, and this subject in particular is really important to me because I think it's one that's frequently overlooked. I've had experience both privately as an entrepreneur, but also in many different organizations from a sales perspective, selling tangible products, intangible products, services, and other items. So I think that there's a lot of this that applies to a myriad of different businesses, and I'm really excited to share some of the things that have helped us be successful, but also some of the other organizations that we've been lucky enough to be able to observe success in as well. Awesome. So I'm going to dive right in. So again, I think pricing strategy is a really interesting subject. It's an easy thing to overlook. I think when a lot of us launch a new product or service, it is easy to plug a price into your offering that's based on a lot of external factors. And I think that this frequently encourages people to be less intentional about a pricing strategy than they ought to be. What's really interesting is when you place a lot of significance around your pricing strategy, you start to think about things a lot more holistically. So, one of the first things that I think about when I think about the importance of a pricing strategy is the impact it has on your actual value perception. And I think a lot of us have experienced this in different environments. You go and you place value around a specific brand, and often that is based on price alone. So for example, when you go through the grocery store, whether conscious or subconscious, as you're evaluating different items, you may place a higher level of importance on the olive oil that's $3 more than the olive oil that's $3 less. And a lot of that comes just from our sort of intrinsic justification of price variances, right? So when we evaluate a product, we associate higher prices with higher value. And it's a relative philosophy because higher prices mean different things to different people. There's of course segments of people that wouldn't even consider, a $20 olive oil versus a $10 olive oil, right? but it does allow you to place a sort of default value on yourself in the marketplace. And that default value is directly associated with what the other competitors and the other players in the marketplace are charging. So I think that that's the first reason to sort of think about the intention of the value proposition differently. The second layer I think about is the competitive impacts. So, this is tied into that first item, in that where you place yourself in the marketplace is gonna stack you up against the competition differently. Your customers are going to be perceiving you in comparison to the other products and services that are on the marketplace. In this day and age, it's really easy for folks to collect information on how much a product or service is going to cost as a whole. So we have a lot of intel as consumers, and because of that, we're going to be evaluating people based on their value proposition, the value they communicate to us through the marketing and sales efforts, and we're going to correlate that to the pricing. So this is a little more thoughtful, right? The perceived value positioning based on price alone is very blind. I have no Google, I have no other information. I just have two products. One is $13 and one is $10. The competitive impacts are a little more deliberate, right? It's who are we actually competing against? How similar are our value propositions? And thinking about things from that perspective. And then the last piece, and I think this is the most overlooked piece of the pricing strategy, is the lost profit opportunity. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in later slides. But the impact that your pricing has on your ability to create bottom line revenue is particularly significant, because price alone doesn't necessarily impact the cost of goods sold. So again, we're going to dive into that thought in a lot more depth, because I think that that's the most highly overlooked element of a pricing strategy. Michael, any thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah, so this is kind of a framework to look at around different ways that pricing strategy affects your product or service. And depending on the industry you're in, you're going to have more or less impact in one of these areas. It's going to impact you more greatly or not, right? So you might be in an industry that's highly competitive, and whether that's locally, or let's say you're online, but you're in a very competitive environment online that's direct to you, that might be impacting you more than perceived value positioning, right? Whereas if you're a service-based business, perceived value positioning is actually an area you really need to look at, because you're in a position where there's so many competitors and it's the industry is so commoditized. You really want to look at perceived value positioning as a way to differentiate yourself in pricing. So as we go through these, they're gonna more or less relate to your industry, depending on where your area of focus is, whether you have a product or service, and if you're in a highly commoditized situation or not in your industry.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Michael. And a really quick self-study to examine is, if your customer's buying decision is done very quickly, meaning in a split second or spontaneously, your perceived value positioning is going to become more important than your competitive impacts. And if your client's buying decision is done slowly over a period of time, potentially days or weeks, then your competitive impacts percentage of your value of your pricing strategy is going to become more significant, because you're allowing those customers more time to do competitive research. So good examples of that: olive oil in the grocery store. I'm not going to get on Google, right? That's never going to happen. I'm just going to look at the price tag, maybe read the bottle. But in a situation like a product like Reconciled, I'm actually going to take the time to evaluate different options, and that's going to give me more time to consider alternatives. So this is the example that I've put together to talk about the lost revenue opportunity associated with your pricing strategy. So this is a little bit of a messy slide, but if you follow it through, we've got two examples of a product, right? We've got product A, and it is $10. We retail that product or resell that product or wholesale that product for $10. It costs us $5 to produce that product. So when we sell 200 units, we net $1,000, right? So pretty simple math on that, right? It's the sort of an elementary profit and loss for a single product. Now, we're going to look at increasing the sale price of that product by 30%. So in product B, we have the exact same product and service, right? And we've increased the price of that product or service to $13 from $10. Now, our cost of production on that product has not gone up at all, right? It's just a straight price increase. So now we only need to sell 125 units to net $1,000. So you can see the exponential impact on elevating pricing alone and the amount of impact that it has on your bottom line. And it's exponential, of course, right? 30% price increase will net 47.5 bottom line income. So that's an important evaluation to do. And there's a lot of questions to ask around this, but in the simplest form, charging more for your products is the easiest way for you to net more revenue off of each unit sold. And I think it's equally important to evaluate the fact that discounting has the reverse effect. So if you were to discount the product by 30%, you're actually decreasing your net income on that product exponentially as well. So it's a really important thing to be thoughtful about, as tempting as it is when you launch a new product or service to default to what the market is telling you to price it at. So the question is how do we hit the sweet spot, right? What's that balance where we're not losing new revenue opportunity, and we're not pricing ourselves out of the game, but we're also pricing ourselves in a way that we can maximize the profitability of each unit sold. So the first thing you have to do is determine your value proposition, okay? And the way that I recommend that you do that is to create a scoring system. There's a few different areas that you're going to be able to determine relative value in your value proposition, right? So what does my service look like compared to the competition? What does my timing look like? How long does it take me to deliver a product or service sold? What's the curb appeal, right? You know, you take a product like Apple and there's a certain aesthetic presence that contributes to value, right? And they have sort of proprietary design elements that add value. What other variables can contribute to the value proposition? Things like your sales process have intrinsic value to your offering. The way in which you deliver your product or service can have value to your offering. And I think it's really important to note that not all of these variables are going to be created equal, and they're not all going to be the same in every single industry. So when you create this scoring model so that you can evaluate your value proposition against the competition or alternatives out there, you need to place elevated importance on the things that have relevance in your industry. For example, you take an item like toilet paper, right? And maybe all the delivery methods are the same, so that's not going to be as much of a contributor to your unique value proposition. Whereas the curb appeal and the actual delivery of the product becomes different. So really take the time to be thoughtful about that evaluation and score yourself against the competition. The mathematics on it is pretty simple. If you have a better overall score, you shouldn't really be cheaper. And if you are cheaper, you shouldn't be cheaper by much, and you should have a really good reason why you're cheaper, right? And maybe that means you're sort of promoting it as a discount. Maybe that means you've found a way to streamline delivery. But you should have an excuse for why you're cheaper if your product has a better score in the value proposition. And if you have a worse score, and I think it's really instinctual for people to get upset about thinking about having a worse score than their competition. But I want to remind everyone that that's okay, right? You can have a worse score and still be a player in the marketplace. But you should evaluate whether or not it makes sense for you to have a cheaper offering than the competition. So it's important to do that math and think about that deliberately. Michael, some thoughts on there?
Yeah, in regards to determining your value proposition and scoring, especially for service-based businesses and online service-based businesses, in this time that we're in, if there's a unique experience that you've crafted or curated that none of your competition provides, and you can label it or name it, brand it, that really is going to differentiate you and provide you a level of experience with your customer that you can promise, you can actually make a promise or a guarantee around. So for example, if you have an onboarding experience that really no one can mimic or copy, and it has a defined journey or steps that your customer takes with you, you can brand it something, so for example, we can call something at Reconciled the Reconciled onboarding experience, or the Reconciled financial journey, or the Reconciled cash flow planning session. And if it's unique to us and it's defined enough for the customer, you can offer it as value and increase the value of your price, and it actually make claims on it that no other competitor can make, because it's something you branded, it's something you named, you defined. So think about the journey or the experience that's curated in a service experience, and that you can put together to increase the value of your service. And if you're a product, especially in a commoditized place, don't think about the product itself. Think about the experience around the product, right? So why do people pay the prices they do for Starbucks coffee? Well, you can buy that Starbucks coffee at the store now and just make it at home, right? You can have the same flavor, the same product experience, but it's everything around it that you pay for. You pay to go to the location. You pay for the interaction with the barista. You pay for that the special way that barista might make the coffee. You pay for them maybe knowing your name when you walk into that one particular location that you've been to hundreds of times. You pay for the feeling of the smell of the location when you walk into the coffee shop. That's why you pay what you do. You pay for the ability to meet with somebody there. That's why you pay for what you do. It's not because the actual coffee itself, although sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not because it's superior. You might actually be able to make comparable coffee at home. It's everything around that product. So think about curating that experience around the product or service, especially if you're in a commoditized position or commoditized industry.
Yeah, I think that's really great, and it is it's particularly important when you're in a competitive space to come up to identify that unique value proposition, right? Because that's your ticket to being unbeatable. Is what is our unique value proposition, and how does that elevate us above the competition? So if you've got an established business, you've been around a little while, you can actually learn some things from your sales patterns that are important to apply to your closing strategies. So one of the first things that I recommend everybody do is evaluate their closing ratios. There's some industry, in fact, not just industry standard, there's some global standards related to closing ratios of a sales process that are helpful to indicate whether or not you're conveying too much value or not conveying enough value. Because when you look at where you're closing against your competition, right, whether or not it's even possible to convey appropriate value based on your price point, you can look at what your closing ratios are and use that as a tool to measure how efficient you're being in that process. So as a general rule, qualified leads, and the definition of those qualified leads is really important. We'll talk about that in a second. Qualified leads should close 20 to 25% of the time, right? So when your salesperson, whether or not that, maybe if you're an e-commerce business, your salesperson is your online platform. When you're an individual salesperson, that's your interactions. But qualified leads, people who are actually considering buying decisions, who are going to make a move, they should close 20 to 25% of the time. So when we talk about the lead, the qualified lead definition, right, we need to make sure that we're looking at that objectively. And a qualified lead is going to be defined as somebody who is considering a purchasing decision, right? Now that doesn't mean they're definitely going to buy a product from someone, but it means that they're taking the buying conversation seriously. And there is an element to that that's varied, but in general, you should be able to identify whether or not a lead is properly qualified before you put them in that basket and say, we should be closing 25% of these people. So in the circumstance that you're better than 25%, you're doing one of two things. You're either conveying more value than your price point indicates to your customer. So, an example of that is if I'm closing 30% of the revenue opportunity that's presented to me through qualified leads, that means that I'm conveying more value during that sales process than my price point justifies, right? I actually theoretically should either have raised my price or be communicating less value through the sales process. Now, the idea of communicating less value through the sales process is kind of ridiculous when instead you can increase your price point and to produce more bottom line revenue off of the transactions. So the solution there is really quite simple. You need to raise your prices to have a more proportionate relationship to the value you're conveying through that sales cycle. And the other sort of situation is that you're charging too little, and this is almost one and the same in that you're not charging enough for the offering. And maybe it has less to do with the value you're conveying through a sales process and more to do with the literal value of your product. So again, the solution is the same in both circumstances. You're in an environment where your prices are disproportionate to the overall perceived value to your client. And in those circumstances, there's very little reason for you not to raise the prices to become more, to balance that ratio out. Michael, some thoughts on that closing ratios?
Yeah. I used to think it was a badge of honor to be able to close every single sales meeting that I've had before, and so I would be like, oh yeah, I close 80-90% of my calls, and then I realized I was leaving money on the table. If you don't have a healthy tension of the customer, enough customers saying no to you, as well as customers saying yes to you, then you're definitely leaving money on the table, and you're not testing fast enough. You got to be willing to test and keep pushing and pushing until you get your closing ratio down. And because in sales, there's no way every single person you're talking to is qualified. It's just not a reality. You'll get better and better at qualifying, but not everybody you get in front of, especially your first few years of business, are qualified leads. So, and also secondly, not everybody who says yes is actually priced correctly or accurately. So you need to continue to test these numbers, especially if they're really high. You need to test these numbers and get them to a place where your price has continued to increase, and now you're at a more consistent, a more realistic closing rate percentage, and you'll see that your profit numbers are way higher at that position. Instead of closing a lot more people at a lower price point, but your profit numbers are much lower because of that. So this is a really good thing to be evaluating in regards to closing rates.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's really easy for people to pat themselves on the back for high closing ratios, and the reality is, in fact, that they may be, there may be a disconnect between the value and the pricing. The other thing that I think is really interesting around that, Michael, that you maybe think about is when you have a broad sales team, right? You need to look at things holistically, right? You may have an exceptional salesperson whose closing ratios are closer to 30%, and you may have the average closer to 20 to 25%, with some underperformers closer to 15 to 18%. So you need to look at things holistically and decide, do I need to increase the prices and funnel things towards my elevated sales talent? Am I better off averaging things over the bulk of it? Or where do I sit in anywhere in between those two options? So that's another thing to consider, because you will have some communicators that communicate exceptional value, especially if you have a designated sales team rather than an online store, for example, that may not have that level of variance. So the next thing to think about is the exceptions, because there are circumstances where you may benefit from an elevated customer acquisition strategy that has a higher closing ratio. So the first exception is that customer acquisition play, right? You're trying to qualify as many customers and close as many customers as humanly possible. And there's a few reasons that you might do that. The most extreme example of a customer acquisition play that I can think of are social media personalities, right? Folks who spend all of their time on customer acquisition at no profit with the intention of bringing in a product later or marketing that audience in some way. So there's definite value in elevated and accelerated customer acquisition, and you need to identify that as a unique play of your business to decide how that's going to impact your pricing strategy, because it's important. So audience building is really that customer acquisition play. Another element is to push out the competition, right? So you may commoditize pricing in an area. You may drive the price way down on a certain product or service so that you can eliminate competition from the marketplace, right? Get them out completely. You see this happen in a lot of different retail environments where when there's businesses right across the street from each other, they're gonna both beat down the price from either side until one of them gives up, and then suddenly there's a monopoly in the marketplace. And that happens in the digital world as well. So you need to think about how your pricing strategy elevates your positioning against the competition. And sort of tied into that is the loss leader play, right? You've got businesses like Amazon, and the intention is to operate at such volume that you're no longer concerned about maximizing margin on every individual item, because you benefit most from being the go-to for all of those different items. And by acquiring enough volume of transaction, you're going to profit enough to justify the means will justify that. And then the last element is if you're in a business where your valuation is largely based on your customer base. And this is the case for businesses with a very specific exit strategy, or folks that are doing a merger and acquisition play. In those circumstances, there may be justification for you to focus more on customer acquisition at extremely low profit margins, so that you can improve the value that your business has in its exit strategy. And it's a very real and relevant way of thinking about things. But again, you need to be very certain that that's the play you're making. Otherwise, you're doing yourself a disservice by minimizing profit along the way. The one other element that I want to talk about there is the idea in that audience building, and any one of these plays you can apply this rule to, is that once you've acquired a mass of customers, you have a marketable audience that you've likely built a high level of trust with if you're a good service provider. And there's value in that because you could sell low margin products to maximize margin on other products. So this is a really important thing to consider, right? Grocery stores might be a really good example of this. You've got 90% of the products and services that we're going to sell are going to be commoditized, and we're going to be beating each other down for the lowest price. Whereas the 10% that we sell that is not commoditized is going to make the majority of our bottom line revenue for the business. So that's an important thought. Michael, thoughts on the customer acquisition plays before I talk about price match?
Yeah. So this is a interesting one, because you are going to have competitors in your space where it is about building their customer base, their audience, or their top line revenue, and irregardless of profit or even gross margin profit. I've seen situations where there's competitors to our customers or people in the space where their number one objective is grab the audience at all costs. We have money to support the cash flow and the marketing needs there, and we will sell them later, and we will worry about or figure out profitability later on either upselling or return purchases or something of that nature. So when you're in a place like this, if you have a business in this position, that's an exception around pricing, because your goal is really just your customer base and top line revenue, and it really has no bearing on the net income or even gross margin being healthy. But for those of you, for most of us who are in a place where you actually want positive, really healthy gross margin and positive net income, then you'll want to think about, in the long term, in the short term, this might work for you, but in the long term, it might not turn out great for you, especially if you're in an industry where there's a high risk of not being able to be successful at this.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that's really important. The next exception I want to talk about is a really interesting thing. There's a game theory concept around price match that I think is really important for entrepreneurs to consider. Price match, I think, from the general consensus, is thought to be to the consumer's advantage, right? And in certain circumstances, it absolutely is. The interesting thing about price match is it does better position the sales organization than the consumer from an overall price to value perspective. So I'll give you a really literal example of that. If you have the product that we talked about earlier that's $10 and costs you $5 to produce, and I've got a company that's selling it for $10, and then Michael opens a company and sells it for $9, and then I compete at $8, and we beat each other down until we've minimized the amount of margin that either one of us is willing to take on that product. At which point the competition gets pushed out of the equation, and the beneficiary has minimized his profit down to almost worthlessness, right? It's really great for the consumer. They get the best price out of that competitive behavior. The interesting thing about price match is that I can charge $8 or $10 for my product, and Michael's company can open and charge $9. But rather than beating each other down for price, I can offer to match his price, and he can offer to match my price. And the end result is that somebody's going to come to me and say, well, Michael's selling it for $9, at which point I can go, well, I'll match his $9. We've both maximized our profit on that. And instead of being in this competitive situation where we're working against each other to push one another out, we've created a situation where the consumer is going to buy from whoever's closer or whoever's more convenient, or one of those other elements of that value proposition that Michael or I are able to convey. And we've actually taken price out of the equation. So the really keen advantage, I think, here to entrepreneurs who are thinking about their price match strategy as an element of their overall pricing strategy is that the businesses who aren't thinking about that are going to beat their prices lower. Mm-hmm. And you are going to be able to maximize profit by understanding that only a certain percentage of your customers are actually going to request the price match. Whereas overall, most of your customers are going to pay the price that you ask for it, as long as you're conveying proportionate value.
Yeah. Yes. And around price match, one recommendation I always make around price match is, in any way you can, instead of price matching, offer additional value that lets you stand out on the higher price point that you're trying to offer, then that's a better position to be in, because it'll allow you to keep your prices high and not ever feel and really leave price match to be the last thing you absolutely do, right? You never want, you don't want the market to put you in the same, you want to try to not let the market or your potential customers put you into the same category, price category as your competitors, if possible, especially if you're priced 2 to 3 times higher. And we often see this in our own space. We have competitors that offer sometimes the same services or perceived to be the same services at 2 to 3 times lower our price. And so we have to do a very good job of articulating the value of why we're priced the way we are. So yeah, there you go.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's really great. And I look at that comment that Michael made, not just for the price match circumstance, but for the negotiation play as well. So I think that there's a lot of value to elevating your perceived value through additional offering rather than reducing the price. You're sort of putting a barricade between you and commoditization. And that's really important for your total market presence. So the last element is the retention strategy, right? And that's a matter of making sure that you're well positioned to keep your clients on. There's going to be especially when you're in a recurring revenue model like Reconciled is, there's going to be constant reminders of the pricing competition play, and that never goes away. With a one-time purchase, it's a less of an issue, although still a relevant thing. When somebody buys a car, for example, doesn't matter if a week later somebody's got the car cheaper, they've already purchased the car and they're kind of committed. But in an environment where you're relying on recurring revenue from your customers, even if it's not scheduled recurring revenue in an e-commerce environment, for example, if you're hoping for repeat business from each of those consumers, there's benefit to pricing certain items in a way that enhances your ability to retain those customers. So it's important to think about the impacts that your pricing strategy has on your customer retention. That'll also be important when we talk about price raising, which is one of the things we'll talk about next. Michael, some thoughts on the retention strategy?
Yeah. So if you click on the other 2 points, your goal is reducing customer turnover, and then or providing additional value without price increase. So if you can, a part of customer retention is you want to keep customers because it's more expensive to get a new customer than to keep a customer that you want to keep, assuming you want to keep them. Now, there are customers that you might have that you might want to do evaluation of customers that you have and run through. You might have a whole list of customers that are not profitable and you actually want to get rid of them. And so you want to think through that sometimes losing customers isn't always a bad value for you, depending on how much of a pain they are for your business, or if you're losing a lot of money servicing them.
Awesome. So the last thing that I want to talk about before we jump to Q&A is market testing. And this is a relatively simple thought process, right? You really need to be asking yourself, could you raise your prices 10% across the board without losing 10% of your customer base? We know from the mathematics, the exponential mathematics we did earlier, that a 10% raise in prices would net more bottom line, even if it meant a loss of 10% of your customer audience. So go through that thought process. The idea of losing 10% of your customers is upsetting. But I think that if you did that exercise and even did a small market test on a portion of your revenue, you would find that most businesses with a sound model could do a 10% increase across the board without losing 10% of their customer audience. So I think that that's an important question to ask yourself on a regular basis to make sure that you're continuing to convey value and value after purchase as well. Then I encourage you to ask the same question for 20%, right? Because again, talking about the exponent of the contribution it has to bottom line, 20% is more than twice as meaningful than as 10%. So go through that same thought process with 20%. So yes, just always remember that 10% after customer losses nets more bottom line revenue. And if your goal as an organization is to improve your profitability to the highest level possible, which it is for many, though not all, then those situations where you have an opportunity to raise prices benefit you, even if it means elevating that value in proportion to it, so that you don't disrupt your customer's perception of just having been charged more for the same product or service. Some thoughts on that, Michael, before we jump into Q&A?
No, that was a really great. This exercise is a great one to go through with a CFO or consultant or your accountant, and or your marketing salesperson. And I think you'll find some surprising results by just going through that evaluation.
Awesome. So I want to jump into Q&A, Michael, and we've received a couple of great questions, so I'm going to direct those questions to you, and I'll jump in with some comments as well. So the first question we got was about TurboTax versus an accountant as an example, right? So you've got the price over value, and that really is their value proposition as a product. So obviously, if they were to charge what an accountant charges, why bother? So how do you evaluate those types of decisions versus stuff that might be a little more comparable?
Yeah. So I mean, if you're offering a digital solution for the masses, which is what TurboTax is, it's going to compete on price, and it's going to compete on price because it's trying to attract volume, right? It's focused on volume, and the value that TurboTax, that's the primary value TurboTax is providing, and it's around this do-it-yourself space, do-it-yourself service, versus an accountant, which you'd think, and you still can get accountants who, if a customer has a more complex situation and they're not able to either use the forms or navigate the forms on a product like TurboTax to complete their return because their situation is so complex, and it requires maybe multiple types of forms, it requires an evaluation, and it actually requires diligence, research, and thought process from an accountant, then that's the value accountant provides, that experience and the value. And so, and especially if it's a matter of, hey, saving, a few $100s versus saving thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, because I've done the research and I'm going to take advantage of tax credits or deductions that you wouldn't otherwise been able to do and do it correctly. Also, there's the value of an accountant saying, I'm willing to represent you if this is wrong. They're signing off on this return, right? If you do it yourself through a piece of software, that claim can't be stated, right? That there's not a person signing that for you and saying, hey, I'm willing to sign off and say that this is correct and represent you to the authorities, the government authorities or the IRS if it's not correct. So there's the price difference there of the value you're paying for, especially for people who have more complex returns or a high net worth. And if you think about if you think of any spectrum of service-based business like accounting, attorneys, right? Anything where there's a do-it-yourself option to the masses online versus a curated, customized, high-value service in person, that accountant better make sure they're delivering a higher quality experience. Because convenience, as we've seen with the growth of Amazon, the success of TurboTax and other products, convenience with low price oftentimes trumps a curated experience that could be even 5 times as high. So you better deliver something of really high level curation of experience that someone's willing to say, hey, look, I'm willing to pay 5 to 10 times more for that. And you might be in a service where they would be only willing to pay 2 to 3 times more. So you've got to really think through that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I would argue that in an environment like that, where you have such a disparity between the low end and the high end, most of those circumstances, we're not even talking about the same customer base. And both people at both ends know that. Mm-hmm. TurboTax is not going after the high-end accounting market. They don't want them. They would be a burden. So that's another thing to remember, is that your product doesn't need to appeal to everyone. And in fact, right, you talk about the sort of value of niching your product into a vertical. Most products actually stand to benefit from excluding a certain group of people in an effort to better communicate your value towards a certain type of person. And you can apply that rule to TurboTax and accountants, right, where accountants are going to work with people with more complex financial situations, the people that wouldn't even consider doing their own taxes because of the complexity. And you can apply the same rule to people who are going to consider a Mercedes-Benz versus the people who are going to buy a used Toyota. It's not the same customer. They're going to use different marketing tactics, different communication methods. And in fact, the person who buys the used Toyota would probably find the Mercedes sales process annoying and cumbersome. and the person who buys the Mercedes would be just uncomfortable with the Toyota sales process.
Right.
So you really are, you're targeting your audience through exclusion, and that relates to the product. So that was a great question. Thanks, Byron. So next question from Michelle Miller. So she's asked, does the way that you phrase your pricing matter? Example, are you better off pricing it $10 versus $9.99 or $9.97?
Yeah.
I've got some thoughts on this, but Michael.
Yeah, there's definitely a psychology around this. And you do want to do some market testing with your customer base to know, because a product that is priced, for example, at $9.25 sounds way cheaper than a product that's priced at $9.97. It's not that much cheaper, right? There's only a 60-something cent difference, but it sounds way cheaper. Now, if you're mincing words on $10 versus $9.99 versus $9.97, yeah, there's going to be a part of your customer base that goes $9.97. Oh yeah, it's only in the $9 range.
Yep.
Whereas there's some of you there's some customers that are going to round that $9.97 or $9.99 to $10. And it's for you to understand the psychology around your customer base and how quick and savvy they are around the numbers and how the number presentation affects them. But when you talk about other ranges like, $9.25 versus $9.57, those two do sound very different. And so obviously the larger the range, the more play around the psychology around pricing will impact how you price.
Absolutely. And I would argue that the relevance of this strategy, that $9.99 versus $10 strategy, was much more impactful 20, 30 years ago than it is today. There's more thoughtfulness behind the purchasing decision around that. Where I think the biggest gap in that is, and I would encourage you to evaluate your own product or service for whether or not this applies. From my own experience, I've recognized that when the price needs to be communicated to a third party, that's where the value ends up being the greatest in that format of strategy. I'll give the example of a husband and wife or a partner, right? If the wife is shopping for an item and it's $990, she may communicate to her husband that it's $900. She's going to round that number in her favor. And the reality is it's a $1,000 product, but by rounding that product, she's able to put herself into a better buying decision. And the same is true for other sort of communicative. If there's more than one party involved in the purchasing decision, and there's a step in between the person who's incentivized to buy and the person who's incentivized to save money, you are going to put yourself in a better advantage by reducing the number of digits that show up on the receipt. So that's an important thing to think about as well. So next question is, how do you do a value proposition to arrive at pricing for a SaaS product?
Yeah, this is a great question, and so in regards to a SaaS product, it does depend on what type of product you're offering and what ultimately the problem you're trying to solve. And the bigger the problem, and also the type of customer you're targeting is going to determine the ability to do value pricing around this. And then two is, what is the customer experience like signing up for your product? What is customer service like for that product? Are you offering real life humans, or is it just a bot online? And also, what are your competitors? How else are your competitors pricing in the space? You can be in an indie industry and see SaaS products where the product looks like and can do the same thing, but in different industries, it's actually priced drastically different. And also, if they're targeting a small business versus medium business versus enterprise, you see the products does exactly the same to these different sets of customers, but because they're priced to a different level of customer or different size, they're able to charge more or less depending on what that market is. So to do that value price, let's say apples for apples, you're trying to compete against just your competitors in the exact same sphere, the exact same customer base, then I think you got to look at what is the problem you're trying to solve. Do you drastically solve it differently? Do you have benefits and an experience that actually values your product significantly higher, and should value your product significantly higher than the product that you're competing against? And are there other elements to your product that you can position yourself in a more luxury, or a luxury position, or a position where, yes, you should be more premium, right? And so you see this same concept in phones, right? In cell phones, where Apple products are just priced higher than Android products. They just are. And there's a variety of reasons for that. They all do the same things. They all provide the basic services that you would expect from a smartphone, but the Apple product is always priced higher, and it's expected to be by the consumer. The consumer would not expect it to be priced less at all, right? Because there's a perceived value that Apple's providing in their product, in all of their products, including like computers as well. You expect their computers to be more expensive than PCs. So there's a reality of that. What else thoughts do you have there, Ian, around this for SaaS products?
Well, I think this is a really great question. SaaS I don't know, SaaS has the advantage and disadvantage of being in that uncomparable space, right? You're designing a custom software product, and your value is going to be uniquely dictated to your customer audience. And I've seen this in software companies where they do undercharge for a product or service based on what they think a client has to spend. And the end result is that they've actually reduced the perceived value of their product. So I think that this falls into that quick decision category, where even with thorough research, you're unlikely to be able to compare apples to apples. So if there's too much disparity between you and your competitors' pricing, you're likely to be excluded based on a lack of trust that's established from the lack of elevated pricing. I'll digress really shortly into a really literal example of this, not related to software, but that's directly tied to this psychology. When Chilean wines were being sold domestically in the United States, they were perceived as garbage wine, right? Early on in the 1980s, 1970s. And there was a sommelier who had moved back to Chile after studying in Europe, and realized that the biggest problem with Chilean wines is that they were being produced at an extremely low cost, and it was inexpensive to import them. So they ended up being fractional of the cost of comparative wines from Spain and all across Europe and other places, even in Latin America. And so this gentleman who had studied to be a sommelier had decided to raise the price as an industry, to create an association that raised the industry prices of Chilean wines. And suddenly they became popular, and it was almost overnight. So it's a real psychology. It's sort of baffling to think about, but you really need to think about how your low prices might be impacting the perceived value, and just how significant that is in your actual marketplace. So the last question, I think, is a great question to end with. So Lily has asked, how do we price something that you've never done before and you don't know what your costs are going to be? Do you just guess at it? Are there caveats in the contract to protect you from losing money? So Michael, that's a really great question.
Yeah. So in regards to a service, I mean, a product that's really that's you probably should know, and you should probably be prototyping costs related to a product. So I think this question more relates to a service, and in regards to a service, there is some testing you want to do with a customer base on what is the perceived value of this service. What is it that you're trying to solve? And how much pain are you actually solving for your customer around this? And that's where a customer interviews, doing small research groups, talking with pricing experts is going to help you with kind of setting that price for the marketplace. I think so. I think there's several approaches, but at the end of the day, you have to be willing to actually price wrong, and then adjust. So your contracts could, and especially even in a service, your contracts could be written in a way where your service is provided for a period of time under that initial price. And that way, then you can change or adjust that price in the future, or you can agree to have that customer as a loss leader or a break even, just because they were willing to take the risk on you early on. So there's a variety of ways to treat that. On the product side, generally you're going to base your pricing, on comparables in your industry. Even if you have a completely new product, there's something comparable you can compare it to, even if it's indirect or an ancillary, or a secondary marketplace where you can compare it to. And they obviously can look at the raw ingredients and the cost of goods sold, the materials, the labor, the packaging, and it's going to take to build the product. And then what kind of margin that you want to build, or you want to start aiming for. But that product should have some perceived value in your marketplace, that regardless the market's willing to pay for. And you got to be careful, because you don't want to be priced too high. Your marketplace may not understand why you're pricing the way you are, and then you've priced yourself out of the market when your customer research says they're only willing to pay a fifth or a half of what you're willing to charge. So
awesome. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that the biggest way to protect yourself is to find your closest competitor, look at what they're charging for the same service, because clearly, anybody who's been established in that offering has found a way to do it at that price in a way that's not an astronomical loss. So that's your biggest protection. If you're going to go into blind pricing like that, that's the biggest safety net you can find. Obviously, there's a way to do it. You might have to get creative in how you approach it, but you can piggyback on that, and then you tweak from there, and you may decide that, I can charge more, or I can do it cheaper, and I can charge less to be more competitive. So that's a really great question, and a tough thing to balance. So I'll end us on this.
Yeah.
Last, probably the best question in the whole batch, right? Should Reconciled raise prices so Ian can get some plants and wall decoration? Because how buried is back there? I have a banner of Michael's face that I usually keep there for inspiration. I pulled it down for the webinar because I thought it would be embarrassing.
There you go. Exactly. Well, yeah, thanks, Byron. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. And again, we'll be announcing some more webinars. And so we'll make sure we let everybody know. And you can go check out our website, getreconciled.co, and take a look at the webinars we have on there. We'll also be putting up the recordings of past webinars on there as well that you can get access to. So, and we'll shoot an email out to everybody about this. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email, Ian at getreconciled.co or Michael at getreconciled.co. And we will talk to everybody soon. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thanks for attending, guys. Take it easy.